Comrades, let us begin without hesitation, without comfort, without illusions. You have been told your entire lives that society changes gradually, that progress drips slowly like water from a cracked pipe, that injustice fades only with patience, and that the powerful must be persuaded rather than confronted. But history itself denies these myths. The world does not change slowly, it changes all at once. It shifts when the people who have bent under the weight of exploitation finally straighten their backs and see that the rulers who claim authority over them possess nothing but the power the workers themselves provide. For centuries you have produced everything, created everything, sustained everything, yet received nothing proportional in return. Under capitalism, the very system that relies on your labor turns your effort into your chains. The owners of capital seize the wealth you generate, then justify their dominance as natural, rational, even moral. They tell you the market is neutral, that inequality is an accident, that poverty is a personal failure. But every page of economic reality reveals what Marx showed again and again. Class inequality is not a flaw in capitalism, it is its foundation. The system depends on keeping you divided, exhausted, and blind to your collective strength. The ruling class speaks of freedom, yet they own the factories, the fields, the technologies, the platforms, the media, the institutions of government. They speak of opportunity, yet the path to upward mobility is littered with the debris of crushed hopes and families ground down by wages that barely sustain life. They speak of order, yet the only order they defend is the order that protects their property while sacrificing your future. They praise competition, but they compete only among themselves while the masses compete for scraps. This is not misfortune, this is design. It is the logic of capital that Marx exposed. The accumulation of wealth at one pole is the accumulation of misery at the other. But comrades, the power they wield is borrowed. The wealth they hoard is stolen. The authority they claim is illegitimate. For every machine that hums, every building that stands, every good that circulates, every service that sustains society, behind it is the worker. Behind it is you. And the moment you recognize that your labor is the engine of all progress, the entire edifice of exploitation begins to tremble. The ruling class fears your unity more than any political party, any election, any reform. They fear the moment you realize that your interests are aligned, not as individuals scrambling in a rigged contest, but as a class bound by shared struggle and shared potential. They fear when you begin to see yourselves not as isolated workers, but as a historical force. For when workers understand their collective power, the world shifts, not gradually, not politely, but decisively. The emancipatory struggle is not one of mere complaint, it is one of consciousness. Marx taught that the oppressed must uncover the structures that bind them, must analyze the economic mechanisms that distort their lives, must recognize that the misery they face is not a personal tragedy but a social product. Once consciousness emerges, organization follows. And once organization solidifies, transformation becomes not only possible but inevitable. Comrades, this is a moment that demands clarity and courage. The crisis of capitalism, unemployment, inflation, exploitation, debt, alienation are not signs of its weakness but signs of its survival strategy. The system thrives on instability because it does not seek human flourishing. It seeks profit. It will continue to grind you down until you decide that enough is enough. Do not wait for gradual change. Do not wait for the powerful to deliver justice. Do not wait for the conditions to become perfect. History reveals that the old order collapses when the oppressed refuse to carry it any longer. The transformation of society comes in leaps sudden, collective, unstoppable when the working class awakens to its own might. The world does not change slowly. It changes when the workers who have built everything decide to reclaim everything. It changes when unity replaces division, when courage replaces fear, when consciousness replaces illusion. It changes when you refuse to remain spectators in a system built upon you. Labor and rise, instead, as the authors of a new and liberated world. Comrades, that moment is not in some distant future. It begins the instant you recognize yourselves as the force that moves history. And that moment is now. The idea that the world transforms not gradually but through sudden collective upheaval, driven by the oppressed, reflects the reality that social change rarely follows a slow, predictable path. Instead, It erupts when the contradictions of a system intensify to the point where ordinary people can no longer tolerate the conditions imposed upon them. Throughout history, the oppressed have lived under structures that promise stability while delivering exploitation, and each generation has been told that progress will come in small, manageable increments if only they are patient enough to wait. Yet the lived experience of workers shows that patience is often nothing more than a strategy designed to prolong their suffering. The pressure builds quietly, visibly, until the moment when people recognize that their misery is not personal but systemic. And once that recognition spreads across a class, the illusions that stabilize the old order begin to fracture. This moment of rupture is not caused by a single action but by the accumulation of countless daily injustices that suddenly converge into collective will. It is in these moments that societies leap rather than step, because the oppressed come to understand that gradualism is a fantasy invented by those who benefit from stagnation. The oppressed do not awaken spontaneously, their consciousness forms through struggle, through witnessing the gap between the promises of the system and the lived realities of exploitation. When workers realize that their exploitation is not an accident but a structural necessity for the functioning of the economic order, their anger takes on a direction. They begin to see themselves not merely as victims, but as agents capable of transformation. This shift in awareness is the spark that precedes upheaval, because once people understand their collective power, the mechanisms that kept them passive lose their grip. Collective awakening is not slow or gentle. It spreads rapidly because it articulates truths that people have felt but never named. When conditions tighten, wages stagnate, prices rise, jobs disappear, rights erode. The oppressed begin to question the narratives used to justify their suffering. The controlled explanations offered by the ruling class start to sound hollow, and the legitimacy of the system begins to erode. The institutions designed to maintain order, media, bureaucracy, political bodies struggle to contain the growing unrest. Small acts of resistance begin to surface everywhere. Workers refusing unreasonable demands, community organizing beyond official channels, individuals seeking truths previously suppressed. These actions connect, forming networks of solidarity that bypass the structures of power. Once solidarity emerges, it accelerates the pace of change because it breaks the isolation that makes individuals feel powerless. As more people refuse compliance, the old order attempts to reassert control, but its tools fear. Division, promises of reform lose their effectiveness. The oppressed have already glimpsed their collective strength and can no longer be persuaded that minor adjustments will solve fundamental problems. At this stage, the transformation gains momentum not because leaders decree it, but because ordinary people withdraw the consent that allows the system to function. Factories slow down, institutions lose authority, and the ruling class becomes increasingly desperate. As the stability of the system dissolves from the bottom upward, what appears sudden is actually the revelation of a long-brewing contradiction that finally reaches the point where the oppressed no longer see the existing order as inevitable. Collective upheaval does not emerge from chaos but from clarity. When people see that their suffering is shared, their interests aligned, and their power vast, the transformation that follows is both explosive and organized. The oppressed begin shaping new forms of cooperation, new visions of social life, new structures rooted in equality rather than exploitation. The world changes all at once because the underlying social relations shift all at once, and the power that once flowed upward into the hands of a few begins flowing outward into the hands of many. The rulers lose control not because they lack resources, but because they no longer command legitimacy or obedience. The oppressed rise not out of desperation alone, but out of an awaken, understanding that they can build a world that reflects their needs, dignity, and collective strength. And it is in this recognition that the pace of history accelerates beyond anything the system can contain. Capitalism thrives on exploitation and inequality as its structural foundation because its very mechanics depend on extracting more value from workers than they receive in return, ensuring that wealth accumulates in the hands of those who own the means of production, while those who produce that wealth remain trapped in cycles of scarcity. This unequal relationship is not a flaw or an unfortunate side effect. It is the core engine that drives capitalist expansion. Workers sell their labor because they have no other means to survive, while capitalists purchase that labor only to appropriate the surplus value workers generate. The entire system operates by ensuring that the producer of value gains only a fraction of what their work is worth, while the owner gains the rest. And this imbalance is what sustains the hierarchy between classes. Without this extraction, profit would disappear, and without profit, capitalism would collapse, which is why the system cannot function without maintaining structural inequality. At every stage of production, inequality is reproduced and justified through the language of freedom, competition, and opportunity. Workers are told they are free to sell their labor, yet the freedom to starve is hardly freedom at all. They are told that competition leads to innovation, yet competition among workers only serves to depress wages and weaken their bargaining power. Meanwhile, the capitalists compete from positions of security, backed by property, capital, and influence, ensuring that the game is rigged in their favor long before it begins. This asymmetry defines the entire system. One class owns resources, institutions, and capital, while the other must labor simply to survive. The capitalist class is privileged not because they are more industrious or intelligent, but because they occupy a structural position that allows them to benefit from the labor of others without contributing equivalent labor themselves. Exploitation becomes even more pronounced as capitalism evolves, expanding into every sphere of life. Work hours grow longer while wages stagnate. Productivity increases while living standards fail to keep pace. And technologies that could alleviate suffering are instead used to intensify labor or replace workers entirely. The logic of capital demands constant growth, constant accumulation, constant extraction, and this imperative compels the system to reach deeper into human life. Even emotions, relationships, and aspirations become commodities shaped and sold by industries that profit from insecurity and desire. Inequality deepens not merely in economic terms, but in psychological and social terms as well, reinforcing division between those who have the means to shape their lives and those who are shaped by forces beyond their control. The ideology of meritocracy attempts to mask this reality by insisting that inequality reflects different levels of talent or effort. But hard work alone does not guarantee advancement, and structural privilege cannot be earned through labor. The children of the wealthy begin life with advantages that compound across generations, while workers begin life fighting uphill battles their entire lives. Education, healthcare, housing, and political influence all follow lines drawn by class. Capitalism claims that anyone can rise through determination, yet the ladder of mobility grows shorter as the concentration of wealth accelerates. A tiny minority owns the vast majority of resources, while millions struggle to meet basic needs. This is not the result of individual failure, it is the expected outcome of a system built to funnel wealth upward. Capitalism also globalizes its inequalities, pushing exploitation across borders to maximize profit by seeking cheap labor wherever it can be found. Entire nations become reservoirs of disposable workers, paid wages far below the value they create, while multinational corporations extract resources and wealth that never return to the communities from which they were taken. Environmental degradation, another form of exploitation, becomes inevitable because preserving nature conflicts with the capitalist imperative to endlessly expand production. The system sacrifices both people and planet in pursuit of profit, treating the world as raw material for accumulation rather than a shared home for humanity. Inequality persists because capitalism requires a class that must work to survive, and another class that survives without working, relying instead on ownership and control. The system maintains itself through legal, cultural, and political structure, designed to protect the interests of the wealthy and suppress the collective power of workers. Even when reforms are granted, they function as temporary stabilizers, not structural changes. They may ease suffering, but never eliminate the exploitation at the heart of the system. As long as profit remains the guiding principle, human needs will always be secondary, and inequality will continue to widen. Workers possess the true power because all wealth and production originate from their labor, and with their collective effort, no industry, institution, or economic system could function for even a moment. Every commodity, every advancement, Every structure that sustains society is the direct result of human labor applied to the natural world. Machines do not build themselves, technologies do not emerge spontaneously, and capital does not grow through its own inherent force. It is labor that animates all of these tools, giving them purpose and value. Yet in capitalism, this power is concealed beneath layers of ideology that elevate capital while diminishing the worker, making it seem as though the owners, managers, and shareholders are the true creators of wealth. But strip away the illusions, and the reality becomes undeniable. The wealth of nations is built by the hands, minds, and sweat of the working class. The capitalist system depends entirely on this labor, yet it systematically obscures the worker's central role by attributing prosperity to entrepreneurship, investment, or market efficiency. These concepts serve to mask the fundamental truth that investment is worthless without workers to transform resources into usable goods, and that efficiency is nothing more than the intensified discipline imposed upon those who labor. The capitalist may own the factory, but the factory remains inert without workers to power the machines and produce commodities. The capitalist may direct production, but direction alone yields nothing unless executed by labor. Even the most advanced technologies represent the accumulated labor of countless past generations who designed, built, refined, and maintained the processes that modern systems rely on. Workers create not only physical products, but the conditions that allow society to function. The food that sustains life, the transportation that links communities, the energy that powers homes and industry, the infrastructures that enable communication, education, and healthcare all originate from labor. Without the daily effort of millions, everything would grind to a halt. This interdependence is the quiet backbone of society, and yet it is rarely acknowledged, because acknowledging it will expose the fragility of capitalist power. The moment workers recognize that their collective withdrawal can bring entire economies to a standstill, the fiction of capitalist superiority collapses. The immense power of the working class lies not only in their labor but in their numbers and unity. Individually, a worker may seem vulnerable, easily replaced, pressured into submission by the threat of unemployment or poverty. But collectively, workers form a force capable of reshaping history. When workers act in unison, refusing to produce, refusing to cooperate, refusing to accept exploitation, they reveal that the ruling class depends on them far more than they depend on the ruling class. This asymmetry is the source of revolutionary potential, the recognition that the means of production are useless without the people who operate them. Yet the system works tirelessly to prevent workers from seeing this power. Through competition, workers are pitted against one another, forced to struggle for jobs, wages, and survival, which obscures their shared interests. Through propaganda, they are told that their labor is unskilled, their role replaceable, their struggles personal rather than structural. Through hierarchy, they are divided into layers that weaken solidarity. Through fear, they are kept compliant, convinced that any disruption will harm them more than it harms them. Powerful, every one of these mechanisms serves a single purpose: to prevent workers from realizing that they are the true architects of society. The value created by workers is appropriated by those who own the means of production, and in this theft lies the fundamental injustice of capitalism. Workers receive wages, but wages represent only a fraction of the value they generate, while the surplus becomes profit for the owners. This extraction is the foundation of capitalist wealth and its primary source of inequality. The more value workers create, the more wealth capitalists accumulate, yet the lives of workers rarely improve proportionally. Instead, they find themselves working harder and longer, while the fruits of their labor enrich those who neither labor nor create. But when workers understand the nature of this exploitation, they begin to see that they hold the power to reclaim what is rightfully theirs. The power of workers is not hypothetical. It is material, concrete, and always present beneath the surface of society. It erupts when conditions become intolerable, when consciousness expands, when solidarity strengthens. It is the power to shut down production, to disrupt distribution, to reshape institutions, to challenge ownership, and ultimately to build a new world based on cooperation rather than exploitation. Workers possess this power because nothing can be produced without them, and the moment they act on that understanding, the entire order of society can be transformed. The ruling class fears worker unity more than any reform or political threat because unity among workers represents the one force capable of undermining the very foundation of capitalist power. Individual reforms can be absorbed, political parties can be negotiated with, and dissent can be redirected or silenced. But the collective organization of workers strikes at the core of how the ruling class maintains control. Capitalism survives by keeping workers fragmented, isolated, and convinced that they have no shared interests. Unity shatters this illusion instantly. When workers recognize that their struggles are not personal misfortunes but expressions of a shared system. Exploitation, a new consciousness emerges, one that exposes the fragility of the ruling order. The power of the capitalists is built not on inherent strength, but on the continuous division of those who actually sustain society. And once those divisions weaken, the entire structure of domination begins to tremble. Unity is feared because it transforms the working class from scattered individuals into a collective force capable of coordinated action. A single worker can be fired, silenced, or replaced. A department or factory can be intimidated or bribed. But a united workforce across industries and sectors cannot be so easily controlled or coerced. Unity gives workers the ability to withdraw their labor at scale, and when they do, the machinery of capitalism grinds to a halt. No amount of capital, property, or political influence can compensate for the absence of labor, because wealth itself does not multiply without workers to produce it. When workers unite, they expose the ruling class's dependence on them, and dependence is the one vulnerability the ruling class cannot publicly acknowledge. Worker unity is also feared because it dismantles the ideological structures that justify inequality. The myth of competition, workers competing for jobs, promotions, survival, keeps them divided and distracted. The myth of individual responsibility makes them blame themselves for hardships created by systemic exploitation. The myth of national, racial, or cultural division keeps them from seeing their shared class position. When workers unite, these myths lose their power. Workers begin to understand that the divisions used to keep them apart are manufactured tools of control, not natural conditions of life. This awakening is a threat greater than any election or legislative reform, because it exposes the true antagonism of society, not between workers of different identities, but between those who labor and those who profit from labor. The ruling class fears unity because unity gives workers the confidence to demand more than temporary concession. Reforms can improve conditions, but often leave the underlying structure of exploitation intact. But worker unity pushes beyond reforms towards systemic change. When workers stand together, they can challenge not only wages and conditions, but the ownership and control of the means of production itself. They begin to question why a minority should own what the majority operates, why profit should dictate human life, and why democratic principles stop at the factory gate. These questions are revolutionary because they attack the core logic of capitalism. A united working class does not simply demand better treatment, it demands a new social order. Unity also amplifies the strategic capacity of workers. Fragmented protests or isolated struggles can be ignored, suppressed, or outlasted, but unified action across workplaces, industries, and regions create a force large enough to reshape political and economic structures. It becomes impossible for the ruling class to maintain stability when transportation workers, doctors, teachers, factory workers, service workers, and countless others unify their demands. This kind of cross-sector solidarity creates a crisis not of policy, but of legitimacy. When millions act together, they reveal that power resides not in wealth, but in labor, not in capital, but in collective human effort. The ruling class, which has always relied on managing and dividing workers, loses its ability to govern effectively. Moreover, worker unity carries the potential to inspire those who have been indifferent or afraid. Courage spreads when workers see each other standing together. A small act of unity becomes a catalyst for broader organization, drawing in those who previously felt alone or powerless. The ruling class understands that unity is contagious, and once it reaches a critical mass, it can no longer be rolled back through repression or propaganda. Fear, once the tool of the ruling class, begins to shift toward the powerful, who see that their dominance is unraveling. Ultimately, the ruling class fears worker unity because unity exposes the truth that their power is not natural, eternal, or unshakable. It is a construct held up by division, consent, and illusion. When workers unite, they withdraw that consent, break those illusions, and reveal the actual balance of power. The rulers fear unity because unity is the beginning of their end. Class consciousness and organized action are the catalysts of revolutionary change, because without a clear understanding of their shared exploitation and a coordinated strategy to confront it, workers remain isolated individuals reacting to hardship rather than a unified force capable of transforming society. Class consciousness is not merely awareness of suffering, it is the recognition that suffering has a common source rooted in the structure of capitalism itself. It is the moment workers realize that their experiences are not accidents or personal failures, but the predictable outcome of an economic system built on hierarchy, inequality, and the extraction of surplus value from their labor. When workers begin to see themselves as part of a collective class whose interests stand in direct opposition to those of the ruling class, the psychological foundations of domination begin to disintegrate. This shift in consciousness is essential because it turns fragmented frustrations into a coherent understanding of power, revealing the true antagonism at the heart of society. Class consciousness develops through lived struggle, through the contradictions workers encounter in their daily lives, through witnessing the widening gap between their contribution to society and the conditions they endure, through seeing wealth concentrate in the hands of those who produce nothing, while those who produce everything struggle to survive. It grows when workers make connections between their personal grievances and the broader workings of the system. When one worker is underpaid, it is a personal hardship. When millions experience the same exploitation, it becomes a class condition. This recognition strips away the illusions used to justify capitalism and expose the mechanisms of exploitation that function beneath the surface of everyday life. As consciousness deepens, workers become more resistant to propaganda that blames them for systemic problems or promises that reform alone can resolve the crises created by capitalism. Yet consciousness alone is not enough. Revolutionary change requires organization, the deliberate unification of workers into structures capable of challenging the power of the ruling class. Organization transforms awareness into action, giving workers the means to assert their interests collectively. It provides the discipline, strategy, and coordination that spontaneous anger cannot sustain. Capitalism thrives by keeping workers disorganized, turning them into isolated competitors rather than collaborators. Organization reverses this fragmentation, forging solidarity across workplaces, industries, and communities. It allows workers to pool their strength, articulate shared demands, and act with purpose. Without organization, workers may revolt, but their uprisings can be contained, redirected, or drowned in repression. With organization, their efforts can be sustained, coordinated, and expanded into a force capable of reshaping society. Organized action manifests in many forms: strikes, unions, councils, assemblies, mass mobilizations, and coordinated resistance across sectors. These forms of collective action demonstrate in practice the power that workers hold. When workers refuse to produce, capitalists cannot profit. When they refuse to cooperate with unjust laws, the machinery of the state falters. When they mobilize together, the ideology of capitalist inevitability collapses. Organized action is feared by the ruling class because it reveals that their authority depends entirely on the continued obedience of the people they oppress. It exposes the truth that the real power in society lies not in wealth or property, but in labor and collective will. Organization also creates new forms of leadership and political consciousness within the working class. It educates workers in struggle, teaching them the skills of coordination, negotiation, strategy, and governance. It builds networks of trust and solidarity that transcend workplace boundaries. It replaces feelings of powerlessness with a growing sense of historical agency. As workers become active participants in collective struggle, they begin to envision possibilities beyond capitalism. Societies organized around cooperation, equality, and democratic control of production. These visions become powerful motivators for sustained action, fueling the momentum needed to confront and dismantle entrenched systems of exploitation. The combination of class consciousness and organized action creates a revolutionary force because it unites understanding with capability. Awareness without action leads to despair. Action without awareness leads to chaos. Together, they form a coherent movement grounded in analysis, solidarity, and shared purpose. Once workers grasp that their liberation depends on their own collective efforts and build the structures necessary to act on the understanding, the ruling class loses its ability to govern through fear, division, and illusion. Revolutionary change becomes not only possible but historically inevitable, driven by the unified force of a class that understands its power and is prepared to exercise it. In the end, the message is unmistakable. The forces that shape history do not reside in the palaces of the powerful or the boardrooms of the wealthy, but in the hands of the workers whose labor sustains every structure of society. The world does not wait for slow reform or polite negotiation. It shifts when the oppressed recognize their shared condition, awaken to their collective power, and organize with purpose and resolve. Capitalism, built on exploitation and inequality, survives only as long as workers remain divided, unaware of the role they play in producing all wealth. But when class consciousness spreads, when unity strengthens, when organized action transforms frustration into coordinated struggle, the foundations of the old order begin to crack. Revolutionary change emerges not as a distant dream, but as the direct expression of a people no longer willing to bear the weight of a system that feeds on their labor. The future belongs to those who create it with their own hands, and once the working class rises with clarity, solidarity, and determination, no force on earth can stand in its way.